Warriors, the time has come! The frost on the cobblestones of the town square was thick enough to crack under the weight of heavy boots. It was the kind of cold that stripped the breath from a man's lungs and made the joints ache with the memory of every hard year lived. But the cold was not what drew the eyes of the morning crowd. It was the girl on the auction block. She was an orc, 23 years old, standing with a posture as straight and unyielding as a forged iron rod. Her shoulders were pulled back, her chin raised against the biting wind, but it was her mouth that held the town's cruel fascination. When she parted her lips to draw in the freezing air, the crowd saw it. Smooth gums, no tusks. In the ancient laws of the mountain clans, tusks were the mark of adulthood, the definitive proof of a warrior's blood. They were meant to split the lower gum like white bone reaching for daylight. Hers had never come. To her clan, she was a defect, a half-made thing. And today she was nothing more than a ledger entry to settle a tax debt. The clan elder, a massive figure draped in wolf furs, stood beside the county clerk. He did not look at her. He spoke of her to the clerk as a man speaks of a plow with a cracked blade. Strong back, he muttered. Good hands. She works. The debt is 400 silver. She covers it in labor. The county clerk adjusted his spectacles, his pen hovering over the heavy parchment. He looked at the tuskless girl, then out at the scattered crowd of townsfolk, merchants, and farmers wrapped in thick wool. He called out the terms. An orc female offered as a labor assignment to clear a clan tax debt. Who takes the contract? Silence answered him. It was a heavy, jagged silence. Men shoved their hands deeper into their coat pockets. Women turned their heads, whispering behind gloved fingers. Disgust and pity mingled in the freezing air. They called her a curse. They muttered that a tuskless orc was no orc at all, just a burden waiting to eat through winter rations. Thalra heard every word. For 23 years, she had survived the brutal hierarchy of the ridges, carrying the weight of their disdain. She did not flinch now. She did not lower her eyes. She merely cataloged the faces before her, reading the weakness in their sneers. Then the rhythm of the crowd shifted. A man stepped forward from the shadows of the livery stable. He did not walk with the puffed-up chest of a wealthy landowner. He moved with the slow, deliberate exhaustion of a man who had carried the world on his back for far too long. His name was Gideon. He wore a canvas coat faded by years of sun and rain, the collar turned up against the wind. His face was a map of deep lines weathered by grief and relentless labor. His eyes were the color of slate, carrying a profound, quiet weariness. Gideon walked past the whispering townsfolk. He did not look at the clan elder. He did not look at the clerk. He stopped at the base of the wooden platform and looked directly at Thalra. She looked back. For the first time that morning, she felt a shift in the air. This man was not looking at her smooth gums. He was not searching for what was missing. His eyes dragged over her broad shoulders, the calluses on her hands, the steady, unblinking defiance in her gaze. He was looking at the machinery of her survival. "What can you do?" Gideon asked. His voice was gravel and wood smoke, low and steady. Thalra held his gaze. "What do you need?" "That is not an answer," Gideon said. "It is the only one I give before I know the stakes," Thalra replied. Gideon's jaw worked. It was not a smile, but the hard tension in his face cracked just a fraction. He pulled his left hand from his coat pocket to grip the edge of the wooden platform. Thalra's eyes flicked downward. The hand was missing 2 fingers, the ring and the pinky. The scars were old, pale, and completely smooth. A carpenter or a woodcutter, she thought. A man who knew the cost of a split second of ruin. "I have 5 children," Gideon said, the words heavy like stones dropping into deep water. "I have a house that is losing a war with the wind. The roof is giving way. The door won't hold the frame, and the winter is coming." "And the children?" Thalra asked. "Are they alive?" "That is a low bar," Gideon said. "It is the one I have," Thalra answered. Gideon turned his head toward the clerk. The clerk cleared his throat, pen poised. "Mr. Gideon, are you volunteering to take this assignment? The man has no coin." Someone muttered from the crowd. "He can barely feed his own." "I am not volunteering," Gideon said, his voice carrying just enough to silence the whispers. "I am running out of options." He looked back at Thalra. "I will take anyone who shows up." "Nobody shows up." "Is that a yes?" the clerk pressed. "It is a yes that feels like a surrender," Gideon muttered. He nodded. "Write it down." The transaction was sterile. The elder turned his back and walked toward the northern road without a single backward glance at the girl who had shared his fires. Thalra picked up her canvas bag. It held a hunting knife, a coil of wire, a fire steel, and nothing else. She stepped down from the block. Gideon was already turning away. He did not ask her name. "You don't want to know what to call me?" she asked, matching his long, uneven stride. "Names are for people who plan to stay," Gideon said, keeping his eyes on the dirt road ahead. "Do you plan to keep me? I can't even keep the rain out of my kitchen," he replied flatly. Thalra almost smiled. A man who answered despair with hard inventory. She could respect that. "I am Thalra," she said. "Gideon. This way." The walk out of town took an hour. The dirt road narrowed, winding up into the foothills where the pines grew dense and the shadows stretched long and cold. Gideon walked in front. He carried a limp on his right side, a subtle drag of the boot that spoke of old injuries ignored for the sake of getting the job done. Thalra followed her, breathing steady, her eyes scanning the tree line. She read the bent branches, the crushed leaves, the faint animal trails cutting through the underbrush. They did not speak. The silence between them was not the awkward quiet of strangers trying to find common ground. It was the heavy, functional silence of two people who understood that words burned energy better saved for staying warm. When they cleared the final bend of the trail, the house came into view. Thalra stopped. She had seen abandoned hunting cabins in better shape. The house sat in a clearing backed against a dense wall of ancient spruce. It was leaning heavily to the west as if exhausted by its own existence. The shingles on the roof were rotting, peeling back like dead skin. A section of the front fence had entirely collapsed, the wooden slats half buried in the frozen mud. The front door hung precariously on a single rusted hinge. It was a monument to a man who had stopped caring about tomorrow. "This is it," Gideon said. He did not apologize for the ruin. He merely presented it as a fact of nature. "How long has the roof been open to the sky?" Thalra asked, dropping her canvas bag in the dirt. "Since the spring thaw," Gideon answered. "It is late autumn. I know what season it is," Gideon said, his voice tightening. "Does the roof know?" Thalra shot back. Gideon turned to look at her, his gray eyes narrowed. It was the look of a man accustomed to being left alone with his failures, suddenly forced to stand under a harsh, unapologetic light. He let out a slow, ragged breath. He did not argue. Before Thalra could press the issue, movement caught her eye. The front door, the one hanging by a thread, groaned open. 5 children stood in the shadow of the porch. They were a staircase of dirt, hollow cheeks, and defensive postures. At the front was a boy standing too tall for his frame. He was 11, maybe 12. His brown hair was hacked short, and his eyes were identical to Gideon's, but sharper, completely devoid of childhood. This was Thane. He held a bundle against his chest. A baby. Behind the Thane stood a younger boy, perhaps 9, with quiet, assessing eyes that watched Thalra as if memorizing her weaknesses. That was Bram. Next to him was an 8-year-old with untamed hair, shifting his weight from foot to foot, holding a piece of half-carved wood. Corin. And leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed tight over a faded wool sweater, there was a 7-year-old girl. Her face was locked in a permanent defensive scowl. Alara. None of them looked at Gideon. None of them ran to greet their father. They stared at the towering orc woman with smooth gums standing in their yard. "What is that?" Alara demanded, her voice cutting through the cold air. "That is Thalra," Gideon said. He did not move toward the porch. He stayed in the yard, maintaining a strange, deliberate distance from the wooden steps. "She is here to help fix the house. She's ugly," Alara said without blinking. Thalra looked at the 7-year-old. Compared to what she asked, her voice calm. Alara blinked, thrown off by the lack of anger. What ugly compared to what Thalra repeated? A bear, a mountain, that broken fence. Alara tightened her jaw. "Just ugly. That is a reflex, not an observation," Thalra said. She shifted her attention to the oldest boy. Thane was gripping the baby tightly. The infant was wrapped in a frayed, dirty blanket. The baby let out a thin, reedy cry, a sound so weak it barely carried past the porch. Thalra watched Gideon. At the sound of the baby's cry, the woodcutter's broad shoulders went rigid, his jaw locked. He turned his head sharply away from the porch, staring out into the empty tree line. He did not look at the child. He did not step forward to comfort it. He looked as though he had been struck invisible, paralyzing him in place. Thane's eyes burned holes into the side of his father's head. The boy's knuckles were white as he adjusted the baby's blanket. The hatred and exhaustion in the 11-year-old's gaze hit Thalra harder than a physical blow. There was a chasm in this yard, deep and rotting. The broken roof was the least of this family's problems. "I am going to the timber shed," Gideon said abruptly, his voice rough. He did not look back at the porch. He walked away, taking long, punishing strides toward the back of the property, leaving Thalra alone with the children. Thalra watched him go, a man retreating from his own blood. She turned back to the children. "Does she have a name?" Thalra asked, nodding toward the baby. Thane stared at her, his guard raised high. "No. She looks 18 months old, and she doesn't have a name." "Ask him!" Thane spat, his voice trembling with a rage too massive for his small chest. "I am asking you," Thalra said evenly, "and I am telling you it is not my job to name her." Thane turned sharply, carrying the baby back into the dark house. The other children followed one by one. Bram cast one last calculating look. Corin dropped a wood shaving on the porch. Allura slammed the broken door shut behind them. It bounced off the frame and hung open an inch. Thalra stood alone in the freezing yard. She picked up her canvas bag. She walked past the house, ignoring the open door. She walked toward the dilapidated barn sitting 50 yards from the main cabin. The barn smelled of ancient manure, dry rot, and coal dust. The roof here was relatively whole, though the wind howled through the kinks in the wall planks. There was an old, indifferent draft horse in the corner, chewing on a meager pile of dry hay. Thalra found a corner away from the draft. She set down her bag. An hour later, as the sun began to dip below the tree line and paint the sky in bruised purples and blacks, footsteps crunched on the frost-covered grass. Gideon stood in the doorway of the barn. He held a small oil lantern. The yellow light cast long, shifting shadows across his scarred face. "There is a room inside," he said, looking at her sitting in the straw. "The bed is narrow, but the roof doesn't leak directly over it." "I will take the barn," Thalra said, not looking up as she ran a whetstone down the edge of her hunting knife. The metallic scrape echoed loudly in the quiet space. "Why?" Gideon asked. "I do not know your house," Thalra replied. "I do not know your children, and I do not know you. I sleep where I can see the exit." Gideon studied her. The lantern light caught the missing fingers on his hand as he adjusted his grip. "Fair enough," he said. "Is it?" Thalra stopped sharpening the blade. She looked up, her dark eyes pinning him to the doorway. "Or is it just easier for you if the monster stays in the barn?" Gideon did not flinch. "Smart and fair are rarely the same thing in the mountains," he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy wool blanket, tossing it onto the straw near her boots. "The cold will kill you out here tonight if you let it." "I am an orc," Thalra said. "We do not freeze." "Everyone freezes when the fire goes out," Gideon said quietly. He turned and walked back to the house, taking his light with him. Night descended like a heavy iron lid. Thalra did not sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the agonizing groans of the leaning cabin in the wind. She heard the draft horse breathing, and faintly cutting through the freezing air, she heard the baby crying, a high, desperate wail of hunger and neglect. She waited for the heavy footsteps of a father crossing the floorboards to soothe his child. The footsteps never came. Only the lighter, hurried steps of an 11-year-old boy. Dawn broke gray and brutal. The frost had thickened, coating the world in a shell of white ice. Thalra was awake before the sun crested the ridge. She did not go to the main house. She unzipped her canvas bag and pulled out the coil of rusted steel wire. She walked into the dense spruce forest behind the property. The woods were silent, holding their breath in the deep cold. Thalra moved with the absolute terrifying silence of a predator born to the wild. The townsfolk had seen a Tuskless failure. They did not see the years she had spent surviving on the fringes, pushed away from the clan fires, forced to outsmart the wilderness just as to eat. Her lack of tusks had made her an outcast, but it had also made her lethal. She did not rely on brute strength. She relied on patience. She found the rabbit runs easily, the faint depressions in the frost, the scattered droppings, the gnawed bark at the base of the birch trees. She knelt in the freezing mud, her bare hands working the stiff rusted wire. She fashioned 3 perfect slip knots, anchoring them to heavy roots along the hidden paths. She measured the height precisely, 2 fingers off the ground. Then she climbed a sturdy oak, settling onto a thick branch downwind, and she became a part of the tree. She waited. The cold gnawed at her skin, but she ignored it. Survival was a muscle. You either flexed it or you died. An hour passed, then 2. The sun finally broke through the gray clouds, casting pale, useless light onto the forest floor. A fat, autumn-fed rabbit bolted down the trail. It hit the first snare. The wire snapped tight. A brief struggle and silence returned. By mid-morning, Thalra had reset the traps and claimed 3 heavy rabbits. She gutted them in the woods, leaving the entrails for the foxes, her hands stained dark with blood. When she walked out of the tree line and back into the yard, the house was beginning to stir. Smoke was curling weakly from the stone chimney. Gideon was on the front porch, a splitting maul in his hand, staring at a pile of unsplit logs. His breath plumed in the cold air. The front door was open. Thane was standing in the doorway, balancing the unnamed baby on his hip. Corn and Bram were peering out from behind his legs. Thalra walked into the center of the yard. She held the 3 rabbits by their hind legs. The carcasses swung heavily, the fresh meat steaming slightly in the cold air. Thane froze. The boys behind him went perfectly still. Their eyes locked onto the meat with a feral, hollow intensity. It was the look of children who had eaten nothing but watered-down oats for a month. Gideon lowered the splitting maul. The heavy iron head thudded into the dirt. He stared at the 3 rabbits in Thalra's blood-stained hands. He looked up at her face. "Where did you get those?" Gideon asked. His voice was entirely devoid of its usual exhaustion. It was tight, urgent. "The tree line," Thalra said, calmly walking past him toward the porch. "You bought them." "With what coin?" she asked. "I trapped them. You caught 3 rabbits before noon." Gideon stepped closer, his gray eyes scanning the tree line as if expecting to see a miracle hanging in the branches. "I have lived here for 3 years. I did not know there were rabbit runs in those woods." "You were not looking for them," Thalra said. "What was I looking for?" Gideon asked softly, almost to himself. "Whatever you are using to punish yourself," Thalra replied. The words hung in the freezing air, sharp and unsparing. Gideon's jaw clenched. The muscle fluttered wildly in his cheek. He looked at this massive, tuskless woman. He had paid a tax debt expecting a grunt laborer to haul timber. Instead, he had brought a mirror into his ruined home, and she was forcing him to look at the reflection. Thalra did not wait for his anger. She walked up the wooden steps. Thane stepped up, and his eyes wide, pulling the baby tighter against his chest. Thalra dropped the 3 rabbits onto the wooden floorboards at the boy's feet. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet yard. "Skin them," Thalra said to the 11-year-old. "Can you do that?" Thane stared at the meat. His hands trembled slightly. "Yes," he whispered. "Good," Thalra said. "Then we eat. And after we eat, I'm going to fix your roof." She turned and walked back down the steps, heading toward the timber shed to find a ladder. She did not look back. Gideon stood in the yard, his hands resting on his hips. The wind whipped his canvas coat around his legs. He looked at the meat on the porch. He looked at the fierce, starving gratitude in his children's faces. Then he looked at the broad back of the orc woman disappearing into his shed. For the first time in 18 months, the suffocating grip around Gideon's chest loosened just a fraction of an inch. The house was broken. The family was shattered. But today there would be meat on the table. And a woman with no tusks had drawn the first line in the dirt, daring the winter to cross it. The roof of the cabin did not just leak, it bled. When the afternoon sleet rolled down from the northern ridges, water seeped through the rotting cedar shingles, dripping onto the warped floorboards like the ticking of a dying clock. It was the sound of defeat. Thalra did not tolerate defeat. She stood on the frost-slicked roof, the biting wind whipping her dark hair across her face. Below her, the yard was a graveyard of frozen mud and rusted iron. Beside the house, the tall, gaunt frame of the woodcutter moved with a slow, grinding purpose. Gideon was at the sawbuck. He was cutting replacement planks from a felled spruce. They did not speak. The only sounds were the rhythmic, metallic bite of Gideon's cross-cut saw tearing through green wood and the heavy thud of Thalra's hammer driving iron nails into the rafters above. It was a language of labor, a silent negotiation of space and capability. Thalra watched him from the roof. Gideon's left hand, the one missing, the 2 fingers gripped the raw timber. The pale stumps pressed hard against the bark. He did not ask for pity. He did not stop to rest. He worked with the punishing intensity of a man trying to outrun his own mind. Thalra dropped a ruined shingle to the ground. She climbed down the wooden ladder, her boots hitting the dirt with a heavy crunch. She walked over to the sawbuck. She did not ask for permission. She simply stepped to the other side of the heavy spruce log, clamped her large calloused hands onto the rough bark, and threw her weight backward. The massive log shifted, rolling upward, exposing the clean line Gideon needed to cut. Gideon paused, his breath plumed in the freezing air. He looked at her hands holding the wood steady. He looked at her face. There was no boast in her expression, no demand for gratitude, just the work. He set the saw blade against the wood. He pulled. She held it firm. For 3 hours, they moved like a single-geared machine. He cut. She hoisted. He planed the edges. She carried the heavy timber up the ladder, balancing the awkward weight on her broad shoulder as easily as a man might carry a rifle. The children watched from the porch. They were wrapped in tattered blankets, huddled together against the cold. They had spent their lives watching adults break leave or give up. Now they were watching something build. By dusk, the western slope of the roof was sealed tight with fresh spruce and boiled pine resin. The house smelled of raw sap and wood smoke. It smelled like survival. Inside the cabin, the cast-iron stove radiated a fierce, desperate heat. The 3 rabbits Thalra had caught that morning were gone. The bones had been boiled down for broth. The children sat around the scarred oak table, their bellies full of meat, for the first time since the first snow. The tension in the room had shifted. It was no longer the sharp, brittle tension of starvation. It was the heavy, uncertain quiet of a family trying to figure out what happened next. Corin, the 8-year-old with the wild hair, was sitting on a 3-legged wooden stool near the hearth. He was holding a small piece of birch wood and a dull carving knife. He was trying to whittle a bear. He pushed the blade too hard. The knife slipped. Corin jerked back his elbow, slamming into the side of a heavy wooden chair holding a stack of iron skillets. The chair tipped. The skillets hit the floorboards with a deafening metallic crash. The stool beneath Corin snapped. The boy tumbled to the floor in a heap of tangled limbs and clattering iron. The cabin went dead silent. Thane, the oldest, immediately stepped in front of the baby's cradle, his fist clenching. Bram shrank back against the wall. Alara covered her ears. They all looked at Gideon. The woodcutter was standing by the wash basin. His shoulders went rigid. His gray eyes locked onto the mess on the floor. His hands gripped the edge of the porcelain basin so hard his knuckles turned white. In a house held together by fraying nerves, a loud noise was never just a noise. It was a spark in a powder keg. Corin squeezed his eyes shut, pulling his knees to his chest. He braced himself. He waited for the shouting. He waited for the heavy boots crossing the floor. Thalra was standing by the stove, holding a long iron poker. She looked at the broken stool. She looked at the scattered iron skillets. She looked at the terrified boy on the floor. "Well," Thalra said, her voice a deep, flat rumble that cut through the agonizing silence. "It seems gravity is on strike tonight." She did not yell. She did not rush over to coddle him. She simply stated it as a matter of structural failure. Gideon froze. He turned his head slowly, looking at the towering orc woman holding the fire poker like a scepter. He looked back at Corin, who was peeking through his fingers, completely confused by the lack of rage. Gideon's chest hitched. A strange, rusty sound caught in his throat. It sounded like a hinge that hadn't been oiled in a decade. He put a hand over his mouth. His shoulders shook. And then the woodcutter laughed. It was a rough, gravelly sound dug out from beneath layers of ash and grief. It was quiet at first, then it broke open, echoing off the low ceiling beams. Thane stared at his father as if the man had just spoken in tongues. Alara lowered her hands. Corin blinked, looking from the broken stool to his father's face. Thalra watched the heavy, suffocating darkness lift from Gideon's eyes, if only for a second. The corners of her mouth twitched. She let out a low, rumbling chuckle, reaching down to pick up a skillet. "Are you unbroken?" Thalra asked Corin. The boy nodded slowly. "Yes." "Then pick up the iron," she instructed mildly. "The floor has taken enough of a beating." The tension in the cabin shattered. It did not just dissipate. It broke apart like river ice in the spring. Corin scrambled up, gathering the pans. Bram let out a breath he had been holding for a minute. Even Alara's permanent scowl softened by a fraction. Gideon wiped a hand across his jaw. He looked at Thalra. The firelight caught the deep lines around his eyes. For the first time since she had met him in the town square, he did not look like a man waiting to die. He looked like a man remembering how to breathe. But healing is not a straight line. It is a jagged climb over broken glass. 2 days later, the quiet peace cracked. Thalra was in the back bedroom. The air in there was stale thick with dust and the heavy scent of dried lavender. She was looking for heavy cloth to patch the drafty windows in the boys' loft. In the corner of the room sat a cedar chest. She opened the heavy lid. Inside, beneath folded wool blankets, lay a dress. It was pale blue cotton, patterned with tiny white flowers. The fabric was worn, soft, cared for with a desperate kind of reverence. It did not belong to a child. It was a woman's dress. Thara reached out her thick, green-tinted fingers, lightly touching the hem. "Don't touch that." The voice was small, but it carried the weight of a drawn knife. Thara turned. Alara stood in the doorway. The 7-year-old girl's hands were balled into tight fists at her sides. Her chest heaved, her eyes were wide, shining with a furious, terrified light. "Put it back," Ilara demanded, her voice shaking. Thara did not move abruptly. She did not try to explain herself or offer a hollow apology. She looked at the dress, then at the girl. She recognized the look in Alara's eyes. It was the look of someone guarding the last piece of high ground before the flood takes everything. "This was your mother's," Thara said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition of holy ground. Ilara stepped into the room, her small frame rigid. "You have no right. You don't belong here. You're a monster they sold at the market." The words were designed to cut through with all the desperate cruelty a grieving child could muster. Thalra carefully folded the hem of the dress back into place. She closed the heavy cedar lid. The wooden thud was gentle. She turned to face Alara. "I know," Thalra said. Her voice was steady, holding no anger. "I am a stranger. I am taking up space in a house that remembers someone else." Alara faltered. The lack of resistance robbed her of her momentum. She stood in the center of the room, her fists trembling. "I will not touch her things again," Thalra promised. Her dark eyes held the little girl's gaze. "I am here to fix the roof, little one. I am not here to erase what is underneath it." Alara stared at her. A single tear broke free, tracking through the dirt on her cheek. She turned and bolted from the room, her footsteps echoing rapidly down the hall. Thalra stood in the quiet room. She looked at the closed cedar chest. The ghost of the woodcutter's wife was the loudest thing in this house. That night, the wind howled down from the peaks, rattling the patched windows. The children were asleep in the loft. The cabin was dark, save for the deep orange glow of the embers in the stove. Gideon sat at the oak table. A rusted tin cup of black coffee sat untouched before him. He was staring at his left hand, the thumb rubbing absent-mindedly over the smooth scars where his fingers used to be. Thalra emerged from the shadows. She carried her whetstone and knife. She sat down on the bench across from him. The wood groaned under her weight. "She was angry today," Gideon said quietly, not looking up. "Alara. She is guarding a memory," Thalra replied, drawing the stone down the steel blade. "It is a heavy job for a child." Gideon finally looked up. The firelight flickered across Thalra's face, casting deep shadows over her jaw, over the smooth, unbroken line of her lower lip. "Why did they sell you?" Gideon asked. His voice was low. He was not asking out of cruel curiosity. He was asking as a man who understood the weight of being broken. A clan does not sell its own blood for a few hundred silver pieces unless the blood is poisoned. Thalra stopped moving the whetstone. For a long time, the only sound was the wind tearing at the roof shingles. She looked down at her hands. Massive, scarred, capable of snapping a man's neck or setting a fragile snare. "They did not sell me because I was weak," Thalra said. The words tasted like ash. "They sold me because I refused to be what they demanded." She set the knife down on the table. She leaned forward into the firelight. "You look at my mouth and you see a defect. You see a girl born half-made. That is what the town saw. That is what the clerk wrote in his ledger." Gideon watched her intently. He said nothing. "Tusks are the mark of the warrior," Thalra continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet rumble. "They split the bone when we come of age. They prove we are ready to take a life for the clan." Mine grew. They were sharp. They were strong. Gideon's brow furrowed. He looked at her mouth. "Then what I took a life," Thalra interrupted, her eyes locking onto his. "But it was not an enemy of the clan. It was my uncle. A clan leader who believed that power was measured by how many of his own people he could break. He beat a child to death in the snow for dropping a bundle of arrows. I challenged him. I broke his jaw, and I drove my blade through his shoulder." The fire popped. Gideon sat perfectly still. He was looking at a woman who had been sold as a docile laborer, realizing she was a deposed predator. I did not kill him, Thalra said softly. That was my mistake. When the elder council convened, they called it treason. But my bloodline was too strong to simply execute, so they made an example of me. She raised a massive hand and tapped her lower jaw. They strapped me to a splitting log. They brought the iron tongs they used for shoeing war horses. They didn't just break the tusks. They dug into the gum. They tore them out by the roots so they would never grow back. They took my teeth so the clan would know I was no longer a wolf. I was a sheep. And then they sold me to pay for their winter grain. Silence fell over the table, heavier than the iron skillets that had crashed to the floor. Gideon stared at her. He looked at the scars on her jawline that he had assumed were from hunting. He saw the unimaginable agonies she had survived. He looked at his own missing fingers. A logging accident. A split second of bad luck. Her mutilation was a choice. A punishment for doing what was right. You are not a sheep, Gideon whispered. His voice was rough with a sudden profound respect. Thalra picked up her knife. No, she agreed. I am simply a wolf who has learned to bite without teeth. The shared confession bound them. The air in the cabin shifted, thickening with an unspoken solidarity. They were two broken things sitting in the dark, recognizing the exact shape of each other's fractures. But the deepest fracture in the house was yet to be exposed. It happened 3 days later. The sky was the color of bruised iron. The temperature had plummeted, freezing the water in the well solid. Thalra was in the kitchen, stripping the bark off a thick birch branch to make a new handle for an axe. Gideon was sitting by the stove mending a torn leather boot with a thick needle and wax thread. In the corner of the room, the baby slept in a wooden crate packed with wool blankets. Suddenly, the infant stirred. A low whimper broke the quiet, then a sharp, ragged cough. The baby began to cry. It was not the sleepy fuss of a child wanting a bottle. It was a high-panicked shriek of distress. Thane appeared in the kitchen doorway instantly, as if he had been standing guard in the hall, but he was holding a heavy bucket of frozen firewood. He could not drop it without waking the other children. He looked at Gideon. Dad, Thane said, his voice tight. She's crying. Gideon did not look up from the boot. His hands holding the needle and thread stopped moving. His entire body went rigid. The muscle in his jaw clamped down so hard it looked as though the bone might snap. Dad Thane repeated, his voice rising, pitching into desperation. Pick her up. The baby shrieked louder, her tiny fists thrashing against the wool blankets. Gideon stared at the leather boot in his lap. He breathed in short, shallow gasps. His eyes were wide, fixed on nothing. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a sheer cliff, paralyzed by the void below. He slowly, mechanically turned his head in the opposite direction of the cradle. He stared at the blank log wall. He did not move to comfort his child. Thane slammed the bucket of firewood onto the floorboards. The wood spilled out with a violent crash. The 11-year-old boy marched across the kitchen. He reached into the crate and hauled the screaming infant into his arms. He pressed her to his chest, rocking her with a frantic, unchildlike expertise. He glared at his father over the baby's head. You're a coward, Thane spat. The words were venomous. They held a hatred that no child should be capable of holding for a parent. Gideon flinched as if he had been struck with a whip. But he did not look at the boy. He did not defend himself. He stared at the wall, his chest heaving, his hands shaking violently in his lap. Thane carried the crying baby out of the kitchen, retreating to the dark hallway. Thalra stood by the counter, holding the birch branch. She had watched the entire exchange. She looked at the woodcutter. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening clarity. The unnamed child, the missing fingers, the absolute paralyzing terror in the man's eyes when he heard the baby cry. It was not indifference. It was not neglect born of malice. It was terror. Gideon, Thalra said quietly. He didn't answer. His breathing was ragged. Thalra set the wood down. She walked over and stood directly in his line of sight, forcing him to look at her. His gray eyes were shattered. They were the eyes of a man trapped in a burning room. How did she die? Thalra asked. The question was blunt, a hammer striking an anvil. Gideon squeezed his eyes shut. A single ragged sob tore its way out of his throat. He dropped the boot to the floor. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. The roof of the logging cabin, he choked out the words tearing at his throat. The timber. It was rotten. The heavy snow. It collapsed. He took a shaking breath, the memory bleeding out of him in the dark kitchen. Sarah was inside. She was heavy with the child. I was outside, fetching firewood. I heard the crack. I ran, but I stopped. He lowered his hands. He looked at Thalra, his face twisted in absolute self-loathing. I stopped, he whispered. For 3 seconds. I saw the beams coming down and I hesitated. I was afraid. When I went in, it was too late. The beam pinned her. She was dying. He looked down at his left hand, at the missing fingers. I dug her out with my bare hands. The iron tore my fingers off. I didn't feel it. I pulled her out. The midwife came. They cut the baby out of her while she bled to death on the snow. She looked at me, Sarah looked at me, and she stopped breathing. Gideon stared at the empty crate in the corner. Every time I look at that child, he whispered, the sound completely hollowed out. Every time she cries, I don't see my daughter. I see Sarah dying. I see my own hesitation. I killed my wife. Thalra stood over him. The heat of the stove pressed against her back. The cold reality of the man's trauma settled over the room like a heavy shroud. He was not a bad man. He was a man crushed under the weight of an unpaid debt to the dead. He had sentenced himself to purgatory, and he was dragging his children down with him. Thalra looked toward the hallway where Thane was pacing in the dark, carrying the weight of a father's guilt. She turned back to Gideon. She did not offer pity. Pity was a luxury for the comfortable. You lost your wife, Gideon. Thalra said, her voice a low, thunderous rumble that commanded the space. But you are actively throwing away your children. Gideon looked up at her, stricken. Your guilt is not a shield, she told him, her dark eyes fierce and unyielding. It is a blade, and you are letting it bleed your son dry. She turned and walked back to the counter. She picked up the birch branch and the knife. She resumed carving the wood. The sharp scrape of steel on timber filled the quiet. I can fix your roof, woodcutter, Thalra said, not looking at him. I can put meat on your table, but I cannot hold your child for you. The frost held the valley in a vice. The world outside the cabin was a canvas of dead white and bruised gray, silent except for the wind tearing through the tops of the ancient spruce trees. It was the kind of morning where the cold felt like a physical weight pressing against the timber, looking for a way in. But the silence did not last. It started as a low vibration in the frozen earth, a rhythmic, heavy thudding that shook the loose snow from the pine branches. Thalra was in the yard, splitting kindling with a heavy iron wedge. She stopped. She drove the wedge into a stump and stood to her full height. She turned her face toward the northern trail. She knew that sound. It was not the uneven clatter of a merchant's wagon. It was the synchronized, punishing rhythm of war horses. Heavy, iron-shod, bred for breaking lines. Through the dense curtain of falling snow, dark shapes materialized. 5 riders. They wore the heavy blackened boiled leather of the Ridge clans. Their cloaks were thick wolf fur dusted with white powder. They rode with the arrogant, loose-hipped posture of men who owned whatever ground they stood on. As they broke through the tree line and entered the clearing, the lead rider pulled back on his heavy leather reins. His mount, a massive roan with breath pluming like dragon smoke, stamped its hooves into Gideon's ruined fence. The rider was an orc. His face was a map of old violence. His tusks were long capped with hammered iron. He looked at the leaning cabin, the patched roof, the meager stack of firewood. His eyes swept over it with absolute disdain before locking onto Thalra. Thalra did not reach for her knife. She stood with her large hands resting loosely at her sides, perfectly still. The front door of the cabin groaned open. Gideon stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing his faded canvas coat, but he had not stopped to button it. In his right hand, he held the heavy oak axe handle Thalra had carved for him 3 days ago. He did not raise it. He simply let it rest against his thigh. But the knuckles gripping the smooth wood were white. Thane appeared in the doorway behind him, his 11-year-old face, pale eyes wide as he looked at the armored monsters in his yard. Thalra, the lead rider, barked. His voice was like grinding stones. It carried over the howling wind, loud enough to rattle the window panes. She did not answer. She waited. The war in the east has turned, the rider said, shifting his weight in the heavy saddle. The valleys are bleeding us dry. The Elder Council has invoked the blood draft. Every hand that can hold a spear is called back to the ridges. Your exile is suspended. Thalra looked at the iron-capped tusks of the man speaking. You sold me to a ledger clerk for 400 pieces of silver, she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of anger, devoid of fear. You stripped my mouth and called me a sheep. War changes the math, the rider sneered, resting a gauntleted hand on the hilt of a broadsword strapped to his saddle. A wolf without teeth can still bleed an enemy. You are clan property. You will ride with us. He spurred his horse forward, closing the distance to where Thalra stood. The massive animal loomed over her. Gideon moved. The woodcutter did not possess the speed of a warrior. He had a bad leg, a broken heart, and a left hand missing 2 fingers. But he stepped off the wooden porch and walked directly into the path of the warhorse. He planted his boots in the frozen mud. He raised the heavy oak axe handle, holding it across his body like a barricade. The rider pulled back on the reins, the horse snorting angrily as it was forced to stop. The orc looked down at the gaunt, scarred human in the faded coat. Move, human, the rider growled. You bought a labor debt. The debt is canceled by clan decree. She leaves now. She is not property, Gideon said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying, absolute stillness. It was the voice of a man who had already lost everything that mattered to him, leaving him completely immune to intimidation. The orc laughed, a harsh barking sound. You are a beggar standing in a rotting shack. You cannot hold her. Move aside, or I will let the horse trample you into the mud. Gideon did not flinch. He adjusted his grip on the oak handle. The pale stumps of his missing fingers pressed against the wood. Try it, he whispered. The rider's eyes narrowed. He drew his sword. The steel hissed against the leather scabbard. Enough. The word cracked like a whip. Thalra stepped between them. She reached out and pushed the oak handle down, forcing Gideon to lower his guard. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the woodcutter facing the mounted warrior. The debt is not canceled, Thalra said. Her voice rumbled from deep within her chest. Because the debt no longer exists. I paid it in timber and meat and in the roof over this man's head. You have a duty to your blood, the rider demanded, pointing the tip of the broadsword at her chest. My blood threw me to the wolves, Thalra replied. She looked up at the towering orc, her dark eyes completely empty of reverence. You want me to die for a clan that pulled my tusks from my skull? You want me to fight for the men who made me a joke in the town square? She reached out and placed her massive green-tinted hand flat against Gideon's chest. The woodcutter stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against her palm. I belong to the place that needed me when I was starving, Thalra said. The words echoed across the frozen yard. I am staying. The rider stared at her. He looked at the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. He looked at the broken human standing beside her, willing to die for an orc he had bought at an auction. The rider understood the mathematics of violence better than anyone. He could kill the human. He could try to drag her back. But he saw the look in Thalra's eyes. If he tried to take her, she would kill him before his horse took 3 steps. The clan forgets you, the rider spat. You are dead to the ridges. I have been dead to you for a long time, Thalra said. Go find someone else to bleed for your mistakes. The rider sheathed his sword with a violent snap. He yanked the reins, turning his massive horse away. The 4 other riders followed. They kicked up clumps of frozen mud and snow as they galloped back toward the tree line, disappearing into the white storm as quickly as they had arrived. Silence slammed back down onto the yard. Gideon stood in the snow, his breathing ragged. He looked down at the oak handle in his hand. His knuckles were aching. He looked up at Thalra. They will not come back, Thalra said quietly. They are bullies losing a war. They do not have the men to waste on pride. Gideon nodded slowly. He opened his mouth to speak. Before he could form the words, a sound tore through the quiet air. It was a scream. It came from inside the cabin. It was not the angry shout of a child fighting over a toy. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. It was Thane. Gideon dropped the axe handle. He sprinted for the porch, his bad leg dragging panic, seizing his chest. Thalra was right behind him. They burst through the front door, bringing a rush of freezing air into the dim cabin. Thane was on his knees beside the wooden crate in the corner of the kitchen. The younger children, Bramcorn and Alara, were backed against the far wall, their eyes wide with absolute horror. Thane looked up as Gideon entered. The boy's face was streaked with tears. His hands were hovering over the baby, trembling violently. She's burning, Thane screamed, his voice cracking. Dad, she's burning up. Gideon froze 3 feet from the crate. The baby was thrashing weakly against the wool blankets. Her skin was a terrifying flushed scarlet. Her breathing was not normal. It was a wet, rapid rattle, each intake of air sounding like a desperate gasp for survival. Her tiny fists were clenched tight, her eyes rolled back into her head. The fever had spiked with a violent, sudden ferocity. Gideon's chest seized. The room began to spin. The walls of the cabin vanished. The smell of wood smoke was replaced by the smell of burning pine and blood. He heard the crack of the rotting timber. He saw the snow falling through the collapsed roof of the logging cabin. He saw Sarah's pale face, her life bleeding out onto the frozen ground, while the midwife cut the child from her ruined body. He was back there. He was trapped in the 3 seconds of his own hesitation. Dad Thane shrieked, grabbing his father's coat. "Do something!" Gideon stumbled backward, his hands flying up to cover his ears. He couldn't breathe. The sound of the rattling breaths coming from the crate was the sound of his wife dying. He couldn't look. If he touched her, she would die. Everything he touched broke. Everything he loved, died. He hit the heavy oak table and gripped the edges, his knuckles turning bone white. His eyes were wide, vacant, staring into a past he could not escape. Thane let go of his father's coat. The 11-year-old boy's face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. "You're doing it again," Thane screamed at the top of his lungs. "You let Mom die, and now you're letting her die. You're a coward. I hate you." And words struck Gideon like a physical blow. He folded over the table, a ragged, pathetic sob tearing out of his throat. He was entirely broken. A shell of a man entirely consumed by his own guilt. "I stopped," Gideon choked out, staring at his maimed left hand. "For 3 seconds. I saw the timber coming down and I hesitated. I was afraid. I dug her out with my bare hands. But it was too late. I killed my wife." Thalra moved. She crossed the kitchen in 2 long strides. She did not yell. She did not panic. Thalra moved. She crossed the kitchen in 2 long strides. She did not yell. She did not panic. She knelt beside the wooden crate and placed her massive, cool hand against the infant's forehead. The heat radiating from the small body was terrifying. The child was drowning in her own lungs. "Water," Thalra barked at Bram. "Cold. From the barrel. Now." The quiet 9-year-old jolted into action, grabbing a tin cup and racing to the water barrel. Thalra stood up. She looked at Gideon. The man was hyperventilating, his eyes squeezed shut, drowning in the ghosts of his past. Thalra walked over to him. She grabbed him by the front of his canvas coat and slammed him back against the heavy log wall. The entire cabin shook. Gideon's eyes snapped open. He stared into the dark, relentless eyes of the orc woman. "Listen to me," Thalra growled, her voice a deep, vibrating command that cut straight through his panic. "Your wife is dead. You cannot save her." Gideon choked on a sob, trying to turn his head away. "Look at me," Thalra roared. Gideon forced his eyes back to hers. "You hesitated," Thalra said, her words merciless and precise. "You made a mistake, and it cost you everything. I know what that feels like. But you are not in the snow right now. You are in this kitchen. And your daughter is fighting for her life." She leaned in closer, the scars on her jaw inches from his face. "She does not need a ghost woodcutter. She needs her father." Thalra released his coat. She stepped back and pointed a thick finger at the wooden crate. "Pick up your child." Gideon stared at the crate. The wet, rattling breaths filled the awful silence of the room. The children were watching him. Thane was weeping silently, his anger spent, replaced by sheer terror. Gideon's left hand began to shake. The stumps of his missing fingers twitched. He took a step forward. It felt as though he were walking through deep water. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, to flee the house, to hide in the woods, and let the nightmare end without him. He took another step. He stood over the crate. The infant was so small. She looked exactly like Sarah. The same dark hair, the same shape of the eyes. To reach down was to touch the very source of his agony. Thalra stood beside him. She did not push him. She simply remained there, an immovable pillar of strength. "Breathe," she whispered. Gideon let out a long, shuddering breath. He lowered himself to his knees. He reached out with both hands. His massive, calloused, scarred hands hovered over the thrashing infant. He closed his eyes. "Sarah," he whispered into the dark of his own mind. "I'm sorry." He opened his eyes. He slipped his right hand under the baby's neck. He slid his maimed left hand under her small back, and he lifted her. The moment the weight of the child settled against his chest, the dam broke. 18 months of suppressed agony, 18 months of suffocating guilt and self-hatred shattered into a million pieces. Gideon pulled the burning, fragile body to his chest. He buried his face in the thin, sweat-soaked blanket. He wept. It was not a quiet, dignified crying. It was the ugly, visceral weeping of a man being torn apart and stitched back together at the exact same time. He rocked back and forth on his knees on the hard floorboards, holding the child he had ignored since the day she took her first breath. "I've got you," he sobbed, his voice raw and broken. "I've got you. I'm here." The baby whimpered, her tiny fists unclenching to grip the rough canvas of his coat. She pressed her flushed cheek against his collarbone. Thalra took the cold tin cup from Bram. She knelt beside Gideon. She dipped a clean rag into the freezing water and gently pressed it against the back of the infant's neck. "Hold her tight," Thalra said quietly. "Do not let her go." "I won't," Gideon choked out, his arms locking around the child like bands of iron. "I will never let her go again." The sun set, plunging the cabin into the deep frozen dark of a mountain night. The wind screamed outside, battering the newly mended roof, but the timber held. Inside, the fire in the cast-iron stove roared, casting a warm, flickering orange light across the room. Nobody slept. Thane, Bram, Corn, and Alara sat huddled together on the rug near the hearth, wrapped in heavy quilts. They watched their father. Gideon sat in the heavy wooden rocking chair by the stove. He had not moved for 6 hours. The baby remained pressed to his bare chest, wrapped in a damp, cool cloth Thalro continuously replaced. Gideon's eyes were bloodshot, his face pale with exhaustion, but his gaze never left the small face resting against his heart. Every time the baby's breathing hitched, his arms tightened. Every time she whimpered, he whispered low, soothing words he hadn't spoken since his wife was alive. Thalra sat on the wooden bench across from him. She kept the water cool. She kept the fire burning. She was the sentinel keeping the darkness at bay. Sometime past midnight, the rhythm in the room changed. The harsh, wet rattling in the baby's chest began to smooth out. The frantic, shallow gasps slowed, deepening into the steady, rhythmic breathing of deep sleep. The terrifying heat radiating from her small body began to break. Thalra reached over and touched the back of her hand to the infant's forehead. The skin was damp with sweat, but the burning fever was gone. "She has broken it," Thalra said softly. Her voice was a low, comforting rumble in the quiet room. Gideon looked up. His face was a landscape of exhaustion, but the paralyzing terror was gone. He looked down at the sleeping child. He touched her cheek with his maimed hand. She turned her head slightly, nestling deeper into the warmth of his chest. Gideon closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the wooden chair. A long, slow exhale escaped his lips. It sounded like the end of a very long war. The morning broke clear and devastatingly bright. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in pristine, glittering white snow. Sunlight streamed through the frosted windows of the cabin, painting the floorboards in pale gold. The children had fallen asleep in a tangled pile of limbs and quilts on the floor. Gideon was still awake. He was sitting at the oak table. The baby was cradled in his left arm, awake, staring up at him with fitawadi, curious brown eyes. She reached up with a tiny hand and grabbed the collar of his faded shirt. Gideon smiled. It was a fragile, unfamiliar expression, but it was real. Thalra stood by the stove, boiling water for oats. She watched him. The man who had bought her in the town square was gone. The hollow, haunted shell had been burned away in the fires of the long night. Gideon looked up from the baby. His gray eyes met Thalra's dark gaze. "Her name," Gideon said. His voice was raspy from smoke and weeping. Thalra set the wooden spoon down. She turned to face him. "Her name is Lyra," Gideon said. It was a strong name. It meant music. It meant the return of harmony to a place that had only known discordant noise. "Lyra," Thalra repeated. "It is a good name for a fighter." Gideon looked down at the child, then back to the towering orc woman. "You saved her," he said quietly. "You saved all of us." "I just fixed the roof, woodcutter." Thalra replied, her expression impassive, though her dark eyes held a profound warmth. "The foundation was already here. You just had to remember how to stand on it." Gideon gently placed Lyra back into her wooden crate. The baby babbled happily, kicking her legs. He stood up. He walked slowly across the kitchen, his limp pronounced from the cold and the long night. He stopped directly in front of Thalra. "The labor debt is paid," Gideon said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. "The clerk's ledger is empty." "I know," Thalra said. "You do not owe me anything. You do not owe this clan anything. You are free to walk out that door." Thalra looked at the front door. It hung perfectly straight on its new hinges. She looked at the roof that did not leak. She looked at the children sleeping safely by the fire. And she looked at the man standing before her, a man with missing fingers and deep scars who had stared down armored cavalry with a piece of wood just to keep her safe. "Where would I go?" Thalra asked, her voice dropping to a soft rumble. "Anywhere," Gideon said, his gray eyes searching hers. "But I am asking you to stay." He didn't offer a grand declaration of romance. He didn't promise her the world. He offered her exactly what she needed. A place where she was seen, not as a monster, not as a broken, tuskless defect, but as the strongest pillar in a house that finally felt like a home. "Not for the debt," Gideon clarified, his voice tight with sudden vulnerability. "Because we need you. Because I need you." Thalra looked at him for a long, silent moment. She reached out with her massive hand and placed it over his scarred, maimed left hand. She squeezed it gently. "I belong here," she said. The deep winter settled over the ridges. The snow stacked high against the cabin walls, bearing the broken fences and the frozen mud. But inside the house, the cold could not take root. It was late evening. The children were in the loft. Thane was reading a battered book to Corin and Bram by the light of an oil lamp. Alara was asleep, clutching the blue floral dress tightly against her chest, no longer guarding it with fury, but holding it with peace. Downstairs, the fire crackled in the stove. Gideon stood by the window, watching the snow fall in the darkness. He held a tin cup of coffee. The deep lines on his face remained, the scars on his hand would never fade, but the heavy, suffocating weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He was a man who had walked through the fire and survived. Thalra sat on the edge of the heavy oak table. She was wearing a thick wool tunic Gideon had traded for in the town. The townsfolk still whispered when they went to the market. They still stared at the massive orc woman with the smooth gums and the quiet, dangerous eyes. But Gideon stood beside her, and Thane walked proudly ahead of her, and the whispers shouted no longer mattered. The clan in the east was losing its war. The riders had never returned. Thalra's past was buried under the snow, an empire she had willingly traded for a timber cabin. Gideon turned from the window. He walked over to her. He set his tin cup on the table and stood before her. The silence between them was easy now. It was the comfortable silence of two people who knew the exact shape of each other's souls. He reached out, his maimed left hand gently resting against her hip. He looked up at her, a quiet, enduring affection in his gray eyes. Thalra looked down at him. A slow, rare smile touched the corners of her mouth. The lack of tusks did not make her look weak. It made her look entirely unique, entirely hers. She lifted her large right hand. She took his left hand, the one with the missing fingers. The hand that had dug his dead wife from the snow. The hand that had held his dying daughter and brought her back to life. She did not pull his hand away. Instead, she guided it upward. She pressed his scarred palm flat against the center of her stomach. Gideon froze. The breath caught in his throat. He looked at her hand, pressing his against her body. He looked up into her dark, profound eyes. The firelight flickered across her face. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice trembling, slightly terrified to believe it. Thalra nodded slowly. "The spring will bring more than a thaw woodcutter." Gideon closed his eyes. He let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against her chest, right above where her heart beat with the slow, powerful rhythm of the deep woods. Thalra wrapped her arms around his shoulders, holding him steady. They were not a perfect picture. They were a man shattered by grief and a woman mutilated by her own blood. They were rough-scarred and worn down by a world that had tried to break them. But as the wind howled against the heavy timber roof and the snow buried the bitter past outside, they stood together in the warmth of the fire. The steel had taken a long time to cool, but it had finally set, and it would never break again.